the brides of jihad, married to the Islamic State, women under the caliphate. Now, these are just a few examples of newspaper headlines about the girls and women hailing from over 50 countries, among them France, who joined the extremist group. Now, one woman decided to dive deeper into their stories. Azadeh Moaveni, an Iranian-American writer, traveled across the Middle East, the Mediterranean to Northern Europe to tell the tales of the, quote, Gone Girls. And she's just published this book on the subject, Guest House for Young Widows. Among the women of ISIS, Azadeh, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, you've been reporting on how women's lives in the region have been affected by war for years. But you embarked on this journey for several reasons. One of them being that you found these girls' stories somewhat familiar, relatable even.
As you said, I've been a Middle East correspondent for so many years. I've covered wars and invasions and all the challenges that women have faced, society to society, having access to politics, any kind of civic empowerment. I was shocked at the way women from Europe started to go, however, the way that the violence of the region has somehow knitted itself to the lives of young people in Europe and the West who seemingly were so disconnected from these politics. So I, as a woman, Middle Eastern, Muslim, growing up in the West, I felt as though I had lived both sides of this experience. And I wanted to be able to tell a story that made it intelligible to others. How could these wars and these conflicts draw in these people who are meant to be of us?
And that's the big question, because you describe some of these women in your book as being respectful, well-read, admired, conservative, but not necessarily devoutly religious. What then drew them to this extreme life choice?
You know, every sort of country that drew women to ISIS, I think, unfolded within the confines of its own challenges. Young women from Europe, often very, very young, were drawn and manipulated and led to think that, you know, they could be joining a utopian society where they wouldn't face street harassment for wearing their headscarves, where they wouldn't have to choose between their European identities and their faith. So, I mean, there are common themes, and I think one of them is a sense of exclusion.
And what's interesting here, there is a paradox, because whilst we know ISIS to be very archaic with its values, and it certainly exploited a lot of these women, you say that it also had the women somewhat at the center of its policies, that it actually empowered some of them.
It sounds really perverse. I understand that. I think the thing that we must really bear in mind with ISIS is the way that in the region it unfolded in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. And we saw how women were so central to those uprisings, from Tunisia to Egypt to Yemen to Bahrain in Syria. Women were really actively involved. I think this was a generation of young women across the Arab world who had greater expectations, wanted to have a voice in the unfolding political change in their countries. And we saw how that movement descended into greater repression, civil war, country to country. I think ISIS intuited and saw this untapped sort of young female potential. And it was really the first jihadist group that reached out to women specifically. It offered them full-scale membership. It offered them a role in this utopian project. So I think that, you know, in a way, it responded to the frustrations and desires of young women better in some instances than their governments.
Now, if you can tell us about the guest houses for widows, you describe these as places of deliberate torment. If you can give our viewers a small insight into that.
So guest house, which I borrow for the title of the book, is a place where women upon arrival in the so-called caliphate were held. And that was where they waited to be matched up with a fighter husband. And when their husbands died fighting, they were taken back expecting to marry and marry again. And they were quite, filthy, difficult places. Women were expected to go back out and raise the next generation to offer comfort to another fighter. So it was a really cruel imposition on women. And because ISIS promising brides to fighters was such a key part of its appeal, it was really for so many women who I think kind of traveled to Syria imagining it to be an empowering and potentially state-building experience. It was the first step into a descent into real horror.
And lastly, and briefly, if you can, I have a slightly more difficult question to end with. Given the time that you spent with these girls and women, do you think that they should be repatriated? This is a massively divisive debate that we're having even here in France. Should they be able to go back to their countries?
I understand the public antipathy and revulsion at the very idea of that, especially in Europe and in countries that suffered attacks, ISIS attacks that were plotted in these areas, who see these women as perpetrators of violence that their societies experienced. I understand that, certainly emotionally, morally. At the same time, these camps are very fragile and dangerous places. There are women amongst them who are genuine victims. But even that aside, there's a real, I think, security risk to keeping them there. There's a very real possibility that a lot of these women could go free, and amongst them there are dangerous women. So while it may be politically deeply unpalatable to any government in Europe to bring, jihadist women back on their watch, ultimately, I think, in terms of security simply, it is the more strategic and sensible choice.
Of course, especially here in France, we'll be keeping a very close eye on that developing story. Azadeh Moaveni, thank you so much for being with us to share your experience and to talk to us about this book, Guest House for Young Widows, which is available now. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Sana.